Good morning and welcome. I'm Daphne Richards, Travis County Horticulture Agent with the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Thank you for joining us for this webinar and our Drought to Deluge Gardening Series. We've got a great program lined up for you today, Vegetable Gardening in Central Texas. As part of this program, our presenter may refer to various source material or websites. Don't panic if you don't catch those in time to write them down. All registrants will receive a follow-up email chock full of great stuff, including a link to the recorded session and links to any references or resources listed. Because we have so much to cover today, we'll be hard-pressed to get through the source material, so we'll be holding our Q&A until the end of the program. You may pose a question at any time, and to do so, you'll need to use the Q&A feature. We know firsthand that this topic spurs a lot of questioning, so we have some wonderful panelists today who will be helping from within the Q&A feature as we go along. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can, and we'll follow up after the program with any that we don't have time for. Our presenter today is Sheryl Williams, one of the most passionate and knowledgeable gardeners that I've ever met. Sheryl has been a Travis County Master Gardener since 2010, and currently works as the Horticulture Program Assistant in my office here at AgriLife Extension in Travis County. Like many of us, Sheryl was introduced to gardening by her mom and grandma and has been an avid vegetable gardener most of her life. She practices organic gardening principles and enjoys the challenges of outsmarting garden pests. And I'm excited to share her expertise with you today. Take it away, Sheryl.
Thank you, Daphne. I also want to do a shout out to the Master Gardeners who are behind the scenes with me today, and that is Holly Plotner, Patty Leander, Yvonne Schneider, and Mindy King. So they will be answering questions in Q&A as we go to make sure that we get everything covered. As you know, the answer to any gardening question is two words. It depends. So what you're going to hear from me today is my experience coupled with research that I've done from using Texas A&M resources to try to impart upon you a lot of knowledge. Just because I say something is so doesn't make it so. Why? It depends. So your own individual gardening situation is going to dictate which of these gardening practices you're going to adopt. And any advice that you get from anyone, including books, including Texas A&M AgriLife, you need to be a critical thinker. You need to tear apart that information and apply each step to your garden to learn what is the best practice. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So today we do have a lot to cover, and the topic range is from planting to eating. So plant to plate, and from that we go through site selection, water, soil preparation, fertilizers, weeds and pests, planting, compost and mulch, rotation, and succession planting and harvesting. So a lot to cover today. So the first question that anyone needs to ask themselves is how much to plant. And what's the answer? It depends. You need to identify, first of all, what your constraints are. Vegetable gardening is the most intensive kind of gardening that you can do. And the reason is because you're dealing with annual plants. So you've got that entire life cycle in a very short period of time. So there's a lot of work to do. And it's not just the gardening part of it. If you're growing food, you're going to have to harvest that food, and then you have to prepare it to eat. And a lot of people don't put in the entire seed to plate cycle in their consideration for how much time it takes. I get comments sometimes that people say, oh, I just grow vegetables for fun, and then we never eat anything. And I think that's sad. And if that describes you, then switch to flowers or herbs. Something that doesn't take as much time so that you can enjoy the growing cycle, but not have to feel guilty about not harvesting or eating. The other question you have to ask is, who's going to help take care of this garden? Again, it's an annual plant. And so there's seeding, there's seed bed prep, there's weeding, there's watering. There's a lot of steps in this. And so are you out there by yourself, or are you going to have help? And if you have a family, you have to think about, is your spouse or are your children going to be out there with you? And what is going to be the level of their participation? So when I first got married, I married a town kid. So my husband grew up in Portland, Oregon, and was lucky to know that vegetables didn't come from the store. And so when we first got married, I had to teach him how to shop in the garden first and not buy the same produce at the store that I was already growing. I also had to teach him how to harvest. I had to teach him how to eat things. I finally got the boy to eat beets and okra. So there's a learning curve for anyone that may be helping you in the garden. So you have to think about that. How much time do you need to spend teaching? The other thing is, you need to ask yourself, what do you like to eat? And this is, what do you like to eat, not what you should eat. So you want to make sure that because you're spending so much time in this, you want to enjoy the rewards of your efforts. Don't plant something because you think you should eat more of it. So don't plant, three beds of kale if you hate kale, just because you think you should eat it. Grow what you love. And the other critical thing is, how much sunlight do you have? Because sun is for us, can be a limiting factor in the garden. So how much should you plant? Well, the answer again is it depends. If you can Google this, so don't try to write any of this stuff down. But the general advice is, if you want to provide enough food for a year, that it takes 200 square feet of garden space per person that you are going to feed. Now that assumes that you're going to preserve some of the harvest. You're going to can some of it. You're going to freeze some of it. And it also assumes a full range of vegetables, not just one type of vegetable. And so you can see it from this list. I mean, a 40-foot long row of spinach, 16-foot long row of carrots. If you're breathing out of a paper bag right now, that's okay. This is, again, to do it for one person for a year. But the best advice to start out with a vegetable garden is start small. So it's okay to have just one plant. If you like peppers or you like tomatoes, then grow just that, just to get started. And the reason I say that is because each gardening site is hugely different, especially here in Central Texas. And you need to get used to what the microclimate and soils are and how you're going to grow in that. And especially if you're doing any sort of container gardening, you've got a big learning curve on what kind of soils will work in that container and how much you're going to need to water. So the types of plants that you can grow in a small garden are ones that don't need a lot of space, or you only need one of. And I've got a list of things here, like beets and broccoli, cabbage and carrots. Most of those you can plant pretty close together. Peas and beans you can grow up. Onions, peppers, those sorts of things, tomatoes, okra, and bush type squash, you can plant a very, one or two plants or just a small batch. If you want plants that need, or you have a larger garden, or you are thinking about planting some of these, they need a little bit more space, and that are anything that vines, and that's melons, cucumbers, squash, vining squash, and potatoes and sweet potatoes. You also need room for corn. So if you're going to plant corn, the reason you need more room is you need a lot of plants in order for them to pollinate each other. Corn is wind pollinated, and so it needs to have a critical mass of plants in order for that pollination to occur. When you're planting your garden, think outside the plot. Think outside what is traditionally done. Color outside of the lines. Interplant and use a grid versus row. And I took this photo off of Facebook. I really like this. She's using a muffin tin to help establish a grid pattern in her grow box. And I love that because it's a tool, and you can use the muffin tin to identify your planting holes, and then you can make a vegetable quiche out of a muffin. So I like that a lot. But this shows how to plant in a grid pattern. You can pack a lot more vegetables in a grid pattern than you can in a row pattern. And the reason we kind of default to growing in rows is that's what we learned from the commercial guys, the farmers. Farmers plant in rows because they need to get their equipment in there. They need to get their irrigation lines in there. But for a home gardener, those rules don't apply. So you can pack things a lot closer together. Also consider growing up. So go up. So plant on a trellis or a fence. And if you do that, then you can pack a lot more plants into a place. And also learn to eat your yard. And what that means is that you don't have to isolate your vegetables into a vegetable garden. If you have limited space or your sun, or depending how sun hits your property, you can just put them in a landscape. Red okra, Swiss chard, those plants are beautiful in the landscape. And so you could put them in with your other plants and eat them. One word of caution though, if you're going to do this, make sure that your edibles are not near something that is not edible or is toxic, because you don't want you or your family to accidentally pick something that they shouldn't be eating. So let's talk a little bit more about site selection. If this looks like your garden plot, I am so sorry. We're going to need to talk afterwards. You've got some work to do. The main thing about selecting a site for a vegetable garden is to select a sunny location. Sun is going to be your limiting factor. And there are some plants that require at least 6 hours of sun. And those are anything that are what I call fruiting vegetables. So anything that blooms needs 6 hours of sun. And that's things like beans and peas, your legumes, melons, squash, and things like cucumbers. Root crops also have to have 6 hours of sun. And you're saying, what? Root crops are in the ground, it's dark underground. Why do they need sun? And the answer is because they need photosynthesis in order to produce the sugars that go into that root. So no sun, not enough photosynthesis, not enough sugars produced to go into the root. And so you get pitiful looking root crops. There are some plants that can tolerate a little bit of shade. And those are like the brassicas, the broccolis, and the cauliflowers, or any leafy greens like a lettuce, a spinach, or a chard. The next thing that you have to consider is water. So I have a full capture rainwater harvesting system, and it was designed just to service the vegetable garden. But you may not have that luxury or have a place to capture rainwater. So you need to be thinking about adequate moisture and where you're going to get it. And along with adequate moisture, you also need to be thinking about drainage. So wherever your vegetables are, they need to be located near a source of water. And in some cases, like in a community garden or in some places like apartment groups, you may not be able to locate that garden near a water source, and you may have to haul water into some sort of watering can or bucket. So that should be a consideration of how much you plant and what you plant, especially if you have to haul water. Raised beds are good if you're gardening on limestone or heavy clay soils, because it gives you a planting horizon to grow your vegetables in. You want to make sure that when you're watering, that you want to water to a depth of about 6 inches as infrequently as possible. And the reason we do that is we want to force those roots to seek water. We just now came out of our cool spring period and are, experiencing the first heat wave of the year. And so you don't want those roots to be near the surface. They will dry out. So force your plants to send those roots into the soil. And you do that by watering as infrequently as possible. Use a drip or a soaker hose if you can, because it delivers the water slowly. And use rainwater if it's available. And the reason for that is that municipal water contains chloramine usually, which can be an inhibitor for your soil bacteria. And also it's usually alkaline water. And so it makes your alkaline soils even more alkaline when you apply municipal water. If you have well water, you may have issues with salts or other heavy minerals as well. And the other thing to consider about moisture, especially in the fall or early spring, is that moisture is your #1 frost protector. So you want to make sure those roots are hydrated and the soil is moist in order to combat any cold air that may be sinking onto your vegetable garden. So how much water? So it depends. It depends on what you're growing. So if we divide the plants up, some plants need a lot more water. And in general, it's because they have big leaves and shallow roots. And examples of that is corn, squash, and lettuce. Plants that need less water have smaller leaves or deep roots. And examples of that are okra, tomatoes, and potatoes. And I have another one, which I call needs some. And these guys, the reason they don't need a lot or less is they've got super tough stems and leaves that don't lose a lot of water to evaporation. And that is like things like arugula, collards, and other brassicas like kohlrabi and broccoli. So let's talk about soil preparation. Good soil is a must, and it is the healthy foundation for everything that you're going to do. So you're going to want to spend some time and thought on what kind of soil you're going to be planting in. And in general, especially when we're talking about raised beds, or if you're gardening on limestone or heavy clay, you need at least 6 inches to garden in, but the reality is you really should try to do 12 to 18 inches. Consider raised beds or containers, but if you do either, you're going to have to keep an eye on moisture. There's a lot of gardening advice that comes out of the north, and as a person who's come from the north, raised beds are great because you want to warm the soil up in the spring, and so raised beds are kind of a default if you're a northern gardener. But here it's completely different because we already have warm soils. We don't have cold periods where our soils need to warm up. And we have the additional challenge of these prairie winds that just dry everything out. So if you're going to garden in raised beds or containers because you need to, because you don't have room on in your yard, or your native soil needs a lot of improvement, then you're going to have to really monitor that moisture because it will dry out fast. So what if you live in the land of no soil, as we call anything west of Mopac? So you can build it. If you know that you're going to live there for a while, you can build soil, but it takes a long time, like 10 years or more. So this is a long-term proposition, and you do it through use of compost or cover crops. A cover crop is a plant that you put in your bed that you have no intention of necessarily eating. The whole purpose of the crop is to cover the soil and maybe to use the tops of it to add to your compost or your fertility. You can always get your shovel out and move soil from elsewhere in the yard if you have it. So for instance, if you've got a sloped yard and there's soil at the bottom of the yard, but you need to garden at the top, you could haul that up to the top. The other thing that you can do is buy it. And if you're going to buy it, there's some considerations. You need to look for generic topsoils. And in general, topsoils are usually made of silt that's been hauled in from somewhere else. And you can buy this at the big box stores, but the best source is usually one of the commercial soil yard providers. And we've got a couple here in Central Texas. Avoid anything that says loam, and that's kind of a code word here, is that loam usually means that it's very heavy, has a very high concentration of sand. And we want to be very careful with that, because if you put sandy soil on top of limestone, you will have massive moisture problems. The moisture just goes right on through. And thank you, by the way, for contributing to the aquifer, because all of your irrigation is going to go right down through the limestone. So the best advice I have for, if you find that you're going to have to buy soil, you need to go and look at that soil and feel it in your hands. Do not go on the internet and just order topsoil. So go to the soil yard and go to the bin and look at that soil and see if that's going to work for you. If you're having to buy soil in the bag, buy one bag, bring it home, open it, and then see how that works before you invest in anything else. If you're like me, I garden on the Blackland Prairie. I have nothing but heavy clay soil. So in essence, it's a lot like limestone in that I can't just go put a plant into my native soil. So if you've got heavy clay, you can add 2 to 3 inches of compost annually, and if it's needed. And when I say add compost, you can put it on top and then scratch it in. And when we talk about scratching in stuff, I just use a hand cultivator and then put it on top and then scratch it into the top soil. You're not going to necessarily want to turn everything over. Especially on heavy clay, you do not want to work wet soil because you will get boulders. I have clods of dirt that I keep around just to make me laugh, that even in our big rain events doesn't dissolve those clods. And the other important thing on heavy clay soils is do not walk on your planting beds. So put in stepping stones or whatever you need to do so that you're not putting your weight in there, because you will compact the soil and build yourself a little patio. So the other thing to consider is tilling. And tilling means that you're going to be turning the soil over completely. So should you till or not? And in general, the goal for a home gardener is no till. You want to use the soil food web. And this is your homework assignment. I want you to Google the soil food web and read up on it. The soil food web is the entire system of the life that revolves around our soil. And it is dictated by the plants. So the plants are calling the shots, and they use the soil food web to harness it to get food to the roots. So using a natural system like the soil food web means that you don't disturb that system. And when we say no till, that also means no double digging. So double digging is, especially for northern gardener practices, is people will tell you, oh, you must double dig. Well, that's okay, but just be aware that that's a tillage practice. So you're actually, turning the soil over. So double digging is the same as tilling. So when we say no till, we also mean no double dig. So how do you do this if you don't till? Well, part of it, what you can do is you can cut the plants off, just go with your clippers and cut them off at the soil level, but leave the roots in place. And that way that leaves the fungal superhighway in place, and the roots will eventually die and open up your soil. Now there's some plants that you can do that to and they will re-sprout. And so depending on what it is that you have planted, you may have to pull that plant up. Like fava beans or eggplant in my garden, I can cut them off as many times as I want and they keep resprouting. And sometimes I let them and sometimes I don't. And so I have to make a decision of whether I let them go or if they're destined for the compost bin. So we say no till, but again, that depends because tilling is highly effective for pest control, especially for squash vine borers and cutworms. If you have trouble with any soil-borne or hybrid or overwintering or hibernating insects or things that lay eggs in your garden, if you till them, you will help destroy that. So for me, the answer to this question, do I till or not till, is yes, I do both. And so I have a really, really hard time with squash vine borers. I battle every year. I don't plant squash, I go like 3 or 4 years and don't plant it, and then I try again. But tilling, whatever, if I do plant it, whatever bed I've put that squash in, I make sure that I till that bed and kill those overwintering grubs that go into the soil. And the same for cutworms. So if you are having issues with cutworms or squash vine borers, you may want to consider tilling. But when I say tilling, as like I mentioned, for me, I didn't do the whole garden. I only did the place that I need that for pest control. So no absolute. So let's talk about seed bed preparation. What you want to do is, the goal is to get the maximum seed to soil ratio. So you want that seed to have soil contact. So what that means is that you want to have your soil that there's no big clods in it, but you don't want to pulverize it either. So think of breadcrumbs. Think of something crumbly when you're doing your soil bed preparation. The other thing that you're going to want to do, especially if you're going to plant seeds, is you're going to want to water thoroughly prior to planting. You want that soil to be moist, and so that when the seed is there, it has soil and moisture contact. And we get this question a lot of whether you should pre-sprout your seeds. And Aggie Horticulture just posted a Facebook Live video on their YouTube channel about pre-sprouting watermelon seeds. And it's a great video, but it's all done in the greenhouse. And so I'm like, nothing that they're showing can be done necessarily by the home gardener. I mean, you almost have to have a lab to do what they were doing. So we get that question, should I sprout my seeds? And the answer is, well, that depends. I've tried sprouting seeds before and then tried to transplant them into the yard. And it is so hard. It is so hard, because when you're sprouting a seed, you've got that shoot coming out of the seed. And if you damage that in any way, you're not going to get a plant out of it. So if you're going to sprout seeds, be very careful about that. Now, I do go through a sprouting process if I know my seed is old. So it's sort of like proofing your yeast. So I'll take a few seeds out of the packet and we'll sprout them just to make sure that they're viable. Because I store my seeds in a closet and not because I don't have room in the fridge. And so the lifespan of that seed can be pretty short for me. So I make sure that they're viable before I bother to plant them out. And depending on what I get out of that test, that will tell me how close together, like, do I need to plant more seed than usual, or can I go with just the normal spacing? I want to get on my soapbox a little bit about seed starter mixes that you can get at some of the big box stores. If you're gonna start your seeds, like you're gonna sow a flat of seeds, or you're gonna start them in the house, don't get a seed starter mix that already has fertilizer in it. The soil and the potting mix companies have a genius marketing plan of bundling that together. But the issue is that your seed has to have a root in order for that fertilizer to be taken up. Most of the seed starter mixes have commercial chemical fertilizers in them, which means that nitrogen or those nutrients are raised right away. And so if you start watering like you would do when you plant your seeds, you're going to water those nutrients right out of the seed starter mix. So by the time that the seed is ready to start taking up your fertilizer, it's gone. So do what you can. It's hard. If you go to like the big box stores, it's hard to find a seed starter mix that doesn't include fertilizer. So, but do the best that you can not, if you're going to make a seed starter mix, make your own or buy one that doesn't contain fertilizers. So let's talk about fertilizers. There are so many out there, and you're going to get so much advice on what you should and should not be using. If you are gardening or if you're using native soil in any proportion, you need to get a soil test. And that's going to tell you the ratios of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And we'll send you a link to how you can get your soil tested through Texas A&M. And you can opt for just the basic soil test, which gives you the NPK recommendations, or you can go for the more expensive micronutrient test, or even more expensive test that includes organic matter content. But no matter how you get your soil tested or what your results are, you're always going to need nitrogen. And that's because it's so soluble, and it also disappears into the atmosphere. So you're always going to need nitrogen. You're probably not going to need phosphorus. If you're gardening in Travis County, you're already sitting on top of limestone. And so you're not going to need phosphorus fertilizer. The bad thing about phosphorus is that it ties up other nutrients. So if you add phosphorus fertilizers or compost, you're going to have an even more severe micronutrient shortage. And that happens if you're using manures and mushroom compost, because both of those usually contain large concentrations of phosphates and phosphorus. And many people don't know, but commercial mushrooms are grown on limestone or phosphorus substrates. And so if you're using compost for that, you're adding good fungal elements, but you're also adding a lot of phosphorus. So it's important that you get a soil test so that you know what that range is, and that will help you choose the best amendments. You'll probably need potassium. And so that's why you'll see a lot of gardening advice around using seaweed, because seaweed contains potassium, and you'll probably need that for here. How often should you repeat the test? The answer is that depends. If your gardening practices don't change very much, you can repeat the test every few years. So I did this just for my own information. So when I first, I've been gardening in my plot now for almost 13 years. So when I first moved into my current yard, I got a soil test on my native soil so that I could see what my baseline was. And then because I'm gardening in raised beds, my raised beds are a combination of native soil and compost I make myself. So after 2 years of gardening of that mix, I went ahead and got another test just to see if I'd moved the needle at all. And then I didn't get a test for another 5 years because my gardening practices hadn't changed. And my compost methodology didn't change. But I started to gather coffee grounds from my neighborhood coffee shop. And so I've got a lot of coffee grounds in my compost. Well, that changes the chemical makeup. So once I started doing coffee grounds in my compost, I did that for a couple of years. And then I just most recently got another soil test just to see what has changed. So, but I don't do it every year. There's no need to do it every year. And I can tell you that in the time that I've been here, I've moved the needle a little bit on reducing my phosphorus content, but everything else has, except for organic matter, has stayed relatively the same. And that includes pH. I was lucky my pH wasn't through the roof to begin with. So my new experiment now is seeing if I add sulfur, if I can change that pH. The theory is that if I lived in the north, that they would say you can, but if you live here, the answer is yeah, good luck with that. So when we're talking about fertilizers, here's where you need to become a citizen scientist. And the question is, should you use organic fertilizers or not? And the definition of organic, the normal definition of organic is that organic means that it's decomposed plant or animal materials. So that means it comes from some sort of a living thing. Non-organic means that it does not come from a living source, and that includes minerals and any synthetically derived product like urea. The USDA definition of organic it's complicated because they're using it for food labeling and for organic farming practices. And I really want to encourage you, here's another homework assignment. Go to the USDA site and read what the federal list or what the federal definition of organic is, and what is acceptable synthetic products that you can use and still be classified organic. Yes, the USDA says you can use synthetic products, but it's in very specific circumstances, like for foliar applications and very specific uses. An example of that is using copper, which is a mineral, and for fungicides. So learn what it means and look at the definitions, and then you can decide how it is or which method that you want to apply to your garden. There is no black and white answer here. So depending on what your definition is. So which is better? And the answer is both can be overused. So read the frickin' label, please, I'm begging you. The issue is that both are very effective in different ways. And from a practical application, organic takes longer to deliver nutrients to the soil because it's in a non-soluble form. It needs that soil food web to go through the natural cycle in order to break down those nutrients. Inorganic nitrogen, as an example, or for a synthetic product, delivers those nutrients right away because they're already in a soluble form. So I can tell you, as a master gardener, we get a lot of questions. So on the Master Gardener Help Desk, and here's the typical cycle. And if this is you, I'm sorry, but we will get a question through the Master Gardener Help Desk that says, I applied organic fertilizer and nothing is happening. Well, yeah, because organic fertilizer has to go through the soil food web in order for those nutrients to be delivered. So the person who applies organic gets frustrated because they're impatient. And so they do a second application of organic fertilizer. Now, by the time they get frustrated and apply that second application, enough time has passed so that they see results, which is what they want. They want things to green up right away or shoot up right away. So emboldened by how that second application worked, they then add a third application just for good measure because it's organic, right? So then we get a question through the Master Gardener Help Desk asking why all their plants have died. And we have to break it to them that yes, you used organic fertilizer, but you over-fertilized and killed your plant. So read the label, and if you're using organic, you must be patient. You will not get results right away. And that's one of the reasons why if you're using organic fertilizers, you apply it multiple times through the growing cycle so that the soil food web can keep up with the growing needs of your plant. If you are impatient and you want to see results, then switch to synthetic fertilizers. But again, you must read the label. So apply things either organic or inorganic. Apply them responsibly. Let your plants and your soil test tell your story. So when do you fertilize? You need to deliver it when the plants will need it. That means they have to have roots. So side dressing is okay. What side dressing is putting the fertilizer alongside the plant. And generally use side dressing as a way for the fertilizer to work into the soil food web system and then deliver it to the plant, as opposed to just doing it quickly or through a foliar method. If you're going to use side dressing, make sure the timing is right. So I do use side dressing, and I do it as part of my seeding process. So depending on which seeds I'm planting and when I expect them to germinate, I will put fertilizer alongside where I'm going to seed an area, and with the idea that the fertilizer is broken down in time for the seeds to germinate and develop those roots. So side dressing is okay, only if you get the timing right. You just don't want to lay fertilizer on the ground, scratch it in, and just hope for the best. So be thoughtful about how you're applying any fertilizer. So again, let your soil test tell the story, and then monitor your plants to make sure that they're able to take up it. And if you've got heavy feeders like corn or those sorts of things, the leaves on those plants are going to tell you whether or not they need fertilizer, and they do that through the color of their leaves. They'll either get chlorotic or they'll show phosphorus deficiencies. So how do you apply fertilizer? It depends. So you can use like a granular or solid form where you scratch it into the soil. And again, I use a cultivating hoe or a hand cultivator for that. You're going to apply the fertilizer on top and then work it into the soil. And part of that is that so that it doesn't dry out on top, because everything gets so dry here so quickly. You can use a liquid fertilizer as part of your irrigation. And I've got a photo here of a brass siphon mixer from Lee Valley Tools, excuse me, where you put the fertilizer in a bucket, and then you let the irrigation system deliver the fertilizer to the plant. If you're going to do this, make sure that you're on some sort of a drip system where it's delivering the fertilizer to the ground, not a overhead sprinkler system that's delivering it on top of the plant. You can do foliar applications of fertilizer, but you're going to spray on the underside of the leaf. And the reason you spray underneath instead of on top is that's where the pores are. They're called stomata. So the plant has pores just like human skin, and that those pores have to be open for that moisture to get through. So, and those are generally on the underside of those leaves. The top side of the leaf has the waxy or the protection or the toughness to protect the plant from evaporating off the water and from it also protects them from insects. So if you're going to use foliar, you must spray on the underside of the leaf. So that's a big mistake that people make, is they think they can just go out in a garden hose and spray their plants. Well, all you're doing is spraying on top. Now, if you're spraying on top, some of that's going to drip off onto the soil. So yay, that's a win. But you will also add unnecessary salts to the top of your leaves, and you don't want to do that. In general, what you want to do is you want to avoid any foliar application of manure teas on food crops because of E. coli contamination. So if you're using any kind of animal manure in your composting system or in your fertilizer system, be very, very careful about foliar applications. You also need to know your compost tea. Compost tea is not made equally, and that term compost tea is used very loosely in the trades. If you are making your own compost tea, that's awesome. There's two ways to make compost tea. The best way is to make sure that it's an aerobic system, meaning that you're adding air to how you're composting your tea versus just a tea bag approach, where you're just soaking, compost in water and then using that, basically and then draining it out and then using that on top of it. Depending on where you get your compost tea, it may or may not contain contaminants. If you're concerned about that, an easy way, and even if you're concerned about buying compost or soil that it may have contaminants in it, an easy way to tell is just take a sample of it and throw it in a couple pots or in a flat and grow some lettuce. So lettuce sprouts really quick. And if there's any issues with that soil or that compost, that lettuce is going to tell you that there's something wrong, because lettuce grows fast and it needs a lot of nutrients to start with, and you'll see damage on the lettuce if there's any problems. The other thing, and we get this a lot in the summer, is do not apply fertilizer to water stressed plants. In fact, we're starting to get our temperatures now, if the nighttime temperatures start to hover around 80 degrees, you might want to consider holding off on the fertilizer, or making sure that you only use soluble water fertilizers, because the plant needs a lot of water in order to deal with the heat, and fertilizers contain salts, and they also need that water to put that salt in solution. So if you're asking the plant to regulate the salt intake and the water loss, you're gonna kill your plant. So it's gonna droop and die. And we get lots of questions about that in Domestic Gardener Help that's starting right about now. So let's talk about soil conditioners, and you see people will give you lots of advice of what you should be adding to your soil. So is it hype? And the answer, you got it, is it depends. So I'm going to go through these a little bit. The main thing about soil conditioners, if anyone is telling you, oh, you need to use, fill in the blank, you need to ask them why. What is it exactly that amendment or that conditioner is adding to the soil? What is the outcome you were looking for? What is the point? And if they can't tell you that, that's okay, but you need to go find out for yourself before you actually apply it. One of the things I hear a lot, especially around composters, is the addition of molasses. So molasses is awesome. Depending on the source, it may also contain sulfur, but molasses is a sugar. So if you're adding molasses, you are feeding sugar directly to the microbial population, and they're going to love you for that. You're going to get a huge spike in population, and you'll see a lot of activity, and then you will see a crash. So microbes have sugar crashes just like 2-year-olds. So when do you use molasses? You use molasses if there's a reason to spike that microbial population. So for instance, if you are trying to compost some super woody compost, like you've chipped up a bunch of brush and you want to get things going, you might add molasses just to get things going a little better. If you're trying to remediate an area that has been damaged for any reason, and that includes solarization, like if you're trying to kill weeds and you've solarized an area, you could add molasses to get that microbial population going, because if you've solarized, you've killed everything on those top layers. So there's a reason for it, but it's not something that I believe you should be using all the time. You don't need it. So if it makes you feel good, go ahead, but it could be just a waste of money and time. The other thing you're going to hear a lot about is mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi is super important in the natural processes on this big rock that we're flying through space on. So what mycorrhizal fungi does is it helps the roots to grow and to fetch water and nutrients for the plant. It's naturally occurring. So it's already in the soil. It's not something that you have to add. Now, the reason mycorrhizal fungi has gotten a lot of press is because it's being used more in the greenhouse industry. So because in a commercial greenhouse industry, you're not using native soil, you're using some sort of organic based potting mix, basically, that contains no mineral element. Without any sort of organic or native soil in there, you don't have the microbe population that you would had you been gardening just in your ground. So what frustrates me personally is I see these pictures on the internet, God bless the internet, where they hold up 2 tomatoes right? One's got, this amazing root growth and the other does not. And they say, this one used mycorrhizal fungi and this one didn't. Well, it was grown in a greenhouse with no native soil. So no kidding, is one gonna do better than the other? So again, be careful about what you see there. You don't have to add mycorrhizal fungi to anything because it's already in the soil. But again, it is useful if you're seeding pots in the house or in your greenhouse and you're not using any sort of native soil, go ahead and add it. If you're trying to transplant, in the ornamental garden, it has some uses on trees and shrubs, but in the vegetable garden, it's really not necessary if you're gardening in native soil. If you're gardening in containers, again, and you're not using any native soil at all, then you could add it and you could probably see some benefit. You're also going to see a lot about seaweed, and seaweed is sort of being used as a panacea. Seaweed is made from seaweed, mostly from kelp. And the reason we like seaweed is that it has potassium in it. And especially here in Central Texas, we sometimes do need potassium in our soils. And so it can be a great addition. Potassium is a great mineral in that it really concentrates on the roots. And so your root growth and the plant's ability to weather water stress and other things increases in the presence of potassium. But you'll also see advice on spraying seaweed on your plants and using it for other reasons. You can certainly do that. And there is some, there's no studies done. But if you put seaweed on your plants, you're putting a substance on your plants, it could help with, keeping some pests off. Personally, I have not found it to help protect against pests, but I do use seaweed. So I do use supplemental seaweed on my container plants. I do have a couple of herbs that I grow in containers, and so I will water those in with seaweed. But in the garden, in the regular vegetable garden, I haven't found a need for it. And what I do on these is I run my own tests, right? Because every garden site is the same. So I will run a test between one bed and another, where one I add, an element and the other I don't, if I'm growing the same thing. And then I see if it works. I haven't found seaweed to give me any sort of boost except for in my containers. Liquid humate is one of those other things. And you'll see this in the green industry a lot, where they want you to pay extra for liquid humate. And again, that's really great. Liquid humate is organic. It helps add organic matter to your soil. It can be expensive, but you can get the same results from compost that you make yourself. So I don't see any reason to add it. I use compost in my containers. I have my own compost. And so I will add some of that, my own compost and some of my own native soil to my potting soil mixes so that I can get the full benefit of the natural system. And then you're also going to hear, I call it trace mineral of the month, where people say, oh, you need to add, fill in the blank. And those are all good. Trace minerals are good. They are needed. And here, because of our high phosphorus soils, we have a problem with trace minerals being inhibited because of the alkalinity of our soil and the phosphorus content. And so some of our plants do need more trace minerals than others, but there's no reason for you to, be overly concerned with whatever you hear. One thing I hear a lot of is about selenium. So I'm from the West. And so on the West, those soils are selenium deficient. And so I grew, I gardened, but I also raised livestock in the West. And we actually had to vaccinate our livestock for selenium deficiencies because it's not present in the ground, therefore it wasn't present in the forage, and your animals can die from what's called white mussel disease. Texas is not a state that has selenium deficient soils. So there's not necessarily any reason for you to add selenium. So again, those are from garden advice from people who don't live here, who it's a specific targeted audience. You can't just adapt that to other regions. So this would be, if you see any advice about any trace mineral, take the time, do the deep dive, ask, what is it that you're trying to prevent or enhance by adding this mineral? Be critical, be a critical thinker. So there are some things that you should use every time. And if you're planting legumes, you should use legume inoculants. So there's you hear a lot about, and we're going to talk about it later about crop rotation, where you want to add legumes in order to get nitrogen into your soil, because legumes have rhizobia bacteria that actually pull nitrogen out of the air and deliver soluble nitrogen to the plant. So that's a reason to have legumes in your garden. But if the rhizobia bacteria is not present, they're not going to fix nitrogen. And every legume has its own specific bacteria that it uses to do this. And if you're growing beans right now, and if you still got bluebonnets in your garden, go pull up a bean and go pull up your bluebonnets and compare the roots. Bluebonnets are native here. And so the rhizobia bacteria is already in our native soils. And so you'll see these nodules on the bluebonnets. They should be crusted in nodules. You can think of it as like really bad acne, where the bean will have nice, pretty smooth roots because there's no rhizobia bacteria present to be on those roots. And so if I don't have the bean rhizobia, that means I'm just growing a plant. So I'm not fixing nitrogen in the soil. So my advice is that if you're going to plant legumes, go ahead and buy the inoculant and treat your seeds. Most seed companies sell the inoculant. So if you're going to buy beans or peas or any legume, clover or whatever, buy the inoculant that goes with it. Now, what I have found here in my garden is that once my peas and my fava beans, I bought inoculant for, and they're good. But green beans, I have to treat them every time, because for some reason, and it could be because of the alkalinity, the rhizobia for the beans I plant, like the green beans, don't persist season to season. So again, you're going to have to be your own citizen scientist in your own garden to see what's happening and whether or not you should treat it. But for sure, for the first couple of plantings, make sure to inoculate your seeds and then going forward, test to see if you still need to do it. And compost, you hear us just harp constantly on compost. So I'm going to tell you, I am the queen of composting. So I make my own compost and I make a lot of it, but I have found that I may have reached saturation point. So the general advice is that for compost, you don't necessarily want it to be more than 6% volume of your native garden soil. So why would you say that? If compost is a good thing, why is more not better? And part of it has to do with here in Central Texas and water. So while compost can help regulate moisture, if you have too much compost, it's going to free up the soil so much that the water is just going to pour right straight through. And so you won't be able to water enough. The other thing is that you need mineralized content. These vegetable plants need minerals, especially the flowering plants like tomatoes, need minerals in order to produce well for you. So when I hear somebody say, oh, I planted straight in compost, I just have to say, I'm so sorry. And if there's any way I can take them aside and give them a little education, I do. So if you're planting in containers even, try to put some sort of native soil in there so that you have mineralized content if you're growing vegetables. So it's really important. So this year, because I noticed that my my garden wasn't doing as well as it should be compared to other years on when I've planted the same things. And so I had my soil test done, and I went for the big expensive option, and I got the organic matter content report, and I have 8% organic matter in my garden soil. And that's within tolerance, but that tells me that I need to be moderating that. And I already knew that based upon my irrigation volume, how long it, how long I have to run my drip system and how fast these plants are drying out. So I already knew that I was hitting that tolerance just based upon my watering schedule. So again, there's no better experience, no better advice than your own observations in the garden. So we get a lot of questions about pH. I'm going to tell you, you need to get over it and you need to live with it. So we sit on top of limestone. It is alkaline here in the Austin area. Now, if you live towards Bastrop, or if you're one of those lucky people that live along, creek bottoms, hooray, your soil is not as alkaline. And so you're good to go, and stop bragging because I don't want to hear it anymore. So, but if you don't have that naturally occurring, there's no way that you can really change the pH of your soil unless you are, containerizing it and making it so that you're isolating that soil. So if you're watering with municipal water, you're just pouring alkalinity onto your plants. So if you're going to try to isolate your soil and try to change the pH, you can't use water out of the tap. You're going to have to use rainwater or something, or distilled water, but if you can afford it. So the good news here is that vegetables are way less sensitive to pH than fruit, like tree fruits or berries. So that's the good news. So if you're a vegetable gardener, you shouldn't be as concerned about pH as to somebody who's trying to grow blueberries, God forbid, or something, or an ornamental plant in their garden that needs a more acidic soil. So I'm telling you, as a vegetable gardener, live with it. Figure out in your own garden, using your own native soil, what's going to work best, and live with the pH that you have. You'll be a lot happier because you'll have more success. So learn to live with it. So, okay, well, we're gonna, so that part of the lecture is over. I still have a finger to shake on a couple other topics, but we're gonna take a pause here.
Thank you, Sheryl. Such great info so far. Okay, everyone, we'll take a very quick 5-minute break. So that means we'll start back promptly at 11:08. See you here in just a sec. Welcome back. Remember, everyone, if you have a question, please type it in using the Q&A feature, and we'll get to those as many as time allows at the end of the program. All right, Sheryl.
Thank you. Okay. Pest control, or what in the heck's eating all of my plants? So the first thing you need to understand about pest control is this, that stressed plants attract pests and disease. So there are some strategies around that. So it's not about the pest or the disease, it's about the plant. So what about that plant is attracting the pest and disease? I want you to shift your thinking away from focusing on what you see out there. And the first thing that you need to do is choose the right plant. So we've got a link out to this reference of what we call our high performing vegetable varieties for Central Texas, of things that you will have what we have found you will have the most success with. But again, remember, the answer is it depends. And so your own gardening practices and your specific microclimates is going to help inform you about which vegetable varieties you should be planting. And what I do is that because as I mentioned, I've been gardening here for a long time, or what I consider a long time, so about 13 years, I have developed kind of a catalog of plants that I know do well in my garden. So, but that doesn't mean that they're the only ones that do well. And so I try to plant at least something new every year, either a brand new vegetable that I've never grown before, or I will test out some varieties. And sometimes, like for instance, if I'm just as an example, my favorite bean in the world is called a nickel bean. It's very thin bean where I just go outside and I just eat them right out of the garden. So, but I don't want to get in a rut. So I'm always tasting new varieties against that. So I know that's my gold standard. So is there something else that maybe will produce longer here in Central Texas, or more of? Although my husband doesn't want to hear that because picking beans is his least favorite thing. So in addition to choosing the right plant, the other issue is that you need to plant it at the right time. So if you've been gardening for more than 5 minutes here in Austin, you know that the variability of the temperatures and rainfall is crazy. There is no normal here. There is no average. There is nothing that we can count on. But there are some general guidelines, and we've got two limiting factors here that we're going to talk about later, which is frost and heat. But if you are planting your broccoli in June, you're going to have some issues. You're going to have issues with a whole lot of pests that are going to want to be eaten on that broccoli. And in fact, if you still got broccoli or collards or any cole crop in the ground right now, you've got some pest issues. And towards the end of the summer, you're going to have a completely different pest issue. Like you're going to start seeing scale insects and all kinds of things. So it's really important that you understand that plant, understand what its tolerance range is, and when the optimum time is to garden. And I'll tell you, in Central Texas, for me, my gardening season is in the winter. So I'm the person that is planting in September and gardening all the way through June. So in normal years, my gardening end date for most of the garden is June 1st. So I have finished everything on June 1st, and the only thing I carry over the summer are just heat-loving plants that can tolerate our heat. So it's really important that you pay attention to the calendar and that you develop within your own yard how far you can push it, for as far as having vegetables in the ground. So the main thing to do is to practice integrated pest management. So IPM means that you want more bugs in your yard, not less. Again, you want to invoke the natural system. You want everyone to come to your house because insect predators are super effective and they're free. They work for free. I love that. Nothing works for free here. So you want more of that. And the reason you want more bugs in your yard is you want to engage that system so that you want to make sure that you have both food and predators present so that that cycle continues in your yard. So that's why spraying, even if it's with organic pesticide, kills everything, good and bad. So for me, I do not spray, nada. So because I want to make sure that everybody out there is doing their job. So the key way to do that is diversity. So plant a diverse garden. Plant things that more than one crop. And if you've got a small garden and you can only plant a few things, that's okay. But just know that you're going to be battling particular pests all the time. So develop a strategy for that, and don't give up or know when to say when. The other thing I do in my garden is I plant a trap plant. Now, a trap plant is not a plant with tiny little cages on it. It is a plant that actually attracts the bad things. It attracts aphids. It attracts beetles. It attracts things to it. And you're just like going, what in the world? Well, the reason you do that is to make sure that you have a constant food buffet for your predators. And in my garden, I love milkweed. So I've got milkweed in my garden. Why? Because it's an aphid magnet. It's constantly covered in aphids. And the good news is that the aphids that are on the milkweed don't migrate to other plants. They're pretty specific to milkweed. But ladybugs and lacewings don't know that. So it's just a 24-hour buffet for them. And so I've always got ladybug larvae and lacewing larvae all throughout the garden because I have a better buffet than what you can get at Whole Foods, that's for sure. So you can use trap plants. Depending on the time of year, I'll use other kinds of plants. Another example of an aphid magnet for me is nasturtiums. So I grow nasturtiums over the winter into the cool season. And in the summer, marigolds are a trap plant. And you're going to say, what? Marigolds are supposed to be a bug repellent. And they are, except for spider mites. So they will attract spider mites. So I will plant marigolds around. And then when the plant gets super infested, I'll just pull it up and get rid of the plant and then replace it with a fresh marigold. So if you're using a trap plant and you're doing it like what I am with the marigold, make sure that you dispose of that plant. And so you're not just spreading the stuff around. So if it's super heavily infested, I'll either just put it in the curbside, yard waste recycling and let the commercial guys take it, or I'll actually soak it in a bucket of soapy water and kill everything that's on it before I put that plant into the compost bin. So your main thing is go out into your yard, not right now because I want you to stay here, but go out and find out who are the good guys in your garden or in your garden plot. And if you're in a community garden, that means look around the entire garden, look at other people's plots and around the perimeter. So look out, outside the immediate vegetable area to see what is growing around the perimeter. So you need to get to know the good guys, and you need to get to know them at both their adult and their larval stage. Because in the cases of lady beetles and lacewings, it's the larvae that are the lions of the predators. So the adults also eat the aphids or other things, but it's really the larvae that are the most voracious. And so I've got a photo here of, these are my husband's socks, and this is our outdoor, air drying area, and the lacewings have laid eggs on my clothesline. So I love that. And so you can tell they're lacewing legs because there's eggs, because they're so pretty. They're on a little filament and they hang out there. So if you see these on your plants, you've got lacewings in your garden. The other thing I found that the lacewings at my house like to lurk in my rose bushes, and so so they'll stay in there, and then they will emerge to come out and feed or breed or whatever. One of my other favorites is our little green guys, or brown, depending on the mood of these little anole lizards, gigantic predators in my garden. I watched one eat a squash vine borer moth, and tears fell from my eyes because it was awesome to watch him do that. Another big predator in my yard are wasps. Wasps really like caterpillars, and what they'll do is they'll find a caterpillar like a cabbage looper or any of those things, and they'll sting them and paralyze them and then pack them off and stuff them in their nest so that their babies can have a fresh snack when they emerge. Again, whenever I see a wasp packing off a caterpillar, tears out of my eyes. Another thing that I use a lot in my garden are birds. And so you're going to have a love-hate relationship with birds in the vegetable garden, especially if you're a tomato grower. But birds are huge in my yard. I'm not allowed to have chickens, and so I use wild birds to help me keep ahead of things. And the cardinals and the mockingbirds are gigantic caterpillar eaters and grub eaters. And so without the wild birds, I'd be in a lot of trouble out there. And so I actually toss them grubs. So as I'm digging in the garden, if I find a grub, I'll pull it aside and then, put them out for the birds to eat. And as a result, in my yard, I'm like Snow White. I've got birds following me all over the place because they know, hey, there is the food provider out here. So they act in my yard just like chickens. If you have chickens, chickens are awesome. And so, but you just have to make sure that they don't eat your plant. And usually you can control that by how long you have the chickens in your garden and, the age of the plant in there. So you be creative and employ other things to help you. And that includes little kids. So if you've got pests in the garden, employ your children to go out and go get the bugs. And just a note on wasps. I come from a family who is allergic to bee stings. And so I completely understand hesitation of having any sort of stinging insect in the yard and no judgment. But think about this. What I do in my garden is the wasps actually nest around the perimeter in my ornamental flower beds, which I'm not in very much. And so they live in the ornamental beds and not in my vegetable beds. So I completely understand if you want to remove a wasp nest that's over your door or actually hanging out on your okra, those sorts of things, no judgment, but leave the stuff that's around the perimeter there. And that goes for spiders too. There's some really awesome spiders here that eat a lot. I also have a bug hotel because I want to make sure that I've got both native bees and wasps nesting in my hotel to help me in the garden. If you've got any sort of cold crop in the ground right now, you've got this really awesome, pretty little beetle called the harlequin bug. These are bad. You do not want them. They are pretty. Have a few in the house for pets, but they're not good in the garden. And you should be infested with these right now if you've got cold crops still going. Aphids are starting to come out. I noticed this morning when I was watering, there was a cloud of white flies. I'm like, I'm not ready. And I've still got some residual caterpillar damage. And the caterpillars have changed over from the nice little green cabbage loopers to some other hairy guys. So be careful right now for stinging caterpillars. And if you've got cucumbers in the garden, you're gonna probably see right now some cucumber beetles. And we have a couple different kinds. We've got spotted and striped beetles. So make sure that we've got a page on our website that shows all of the types of beetles so you can recognize them. You're gonna see leaf-footed bugs right around now. You're gonna see squash beetles and other things that are attacking your plants. So the big thing is that you need to become familiar with what is actually going on out there. So you need to visit your garden and look under the leaf and see what it is that's on there, and then go use the internet or get some help in identifying what it is you're seeding so that you can tell the difference between the good guys and the bad guys. So if you decided you've got bad guys, what are some things to do? So we're going to talk about some time-honored no spray control methods. And the first one is physical barriers. And I love this picture from Patty Leander of this squirrel in the tree eating one of her tomatoes. I have a huge rodent problem at my house, so I immediately related to this. But you can erect physical barriers. And that is either by a row cover, and there's different kinds of row covers. But most row covers are made from very fine spun material and are pretty effective of keeping out flying insects. Not so good with rodents. Rodents will chew right through it. You can use netting if you've got bird problems. Be careful with your netting though. If you're going to use netting over your vegetables, make sure that the netting is tight. Because birds you don't want birds to land on it, get tangled up. You also don't want snakes to get tangled up in it. And if you've got poisonous snakes at your house, that's a consideration. But also, it's the good snakes that you do want in your garden that you don't want to kill. So you want to have, garden snakes in there, but you don't want to get them done in the netting. And usually what happens with snakes is the reason they get tangled up in your netting is they're after the bird that got caught in it. So make sure that if you use netting that you monitor it, if you can, multiple times during the day to make sure that you haven't caught something that you shouldn't have. Both Patty and I use micro mesh. Micro mesh is very finely woven row cover it's not made of the spun material. It's pretty effective against both birds and flying insects and rabbits. It is not effective against rats or squirrels. You can use chicken wire. I've had to resort to chicken wire. And so I have basically barricaded myself out of my own garden. So I use chicken wire to keep the rabbits off of my garden plots. I am Elmer Fudd. I've got Wascally rabbits and rabbits are cute, but I'm over them. So, but the only way, for me, because I live in town, I can't just, shoot pests, not that I would even want to, but I have physical barriers. So I have fenced them out of my garden. Now, chicken wire, depending on the size, doesn't work for rats. A rat will go right through that. Also, rats will dig underneath. So I've had issues where they have tunneled underneath my sweet potato bed and eat my sweet potatoes from underneath. So you don't want to hear the language. So the other thing that you can use against rodents and squirrels specifically, or deer, is electric fence. You're going to want to use a livestock fence charger, and we used to use this on the farm. So we did it to keep out coyotes and bears off of our sheep, but it works really good with other things. If you're going to use an electric fence, you need to put signs on it, especially if you live close to people, so that they know that wire is hot. And you also want to make sure that you monitor that wire to make sure that it hasn't shorted out. And just a note on electric fences is that whatever you're trying to shock needs to be grounded. So if a squirrel is going to drop down from a tree onto the fence, he or she is not grounded and won't get shocked. So you have to kind of think about that. You have to experiment if you want to go to that extreme. I am actually considering doing this because I have a long history with livestock fencing, and I'm thinking, you know what? I need to shock those squirrels into the neighbor's yard, but I haven't gone there yet. The other thing you need to consider about physical barriers are your pets, or are your pets the problem, right? So is your dog digging in everything? Are the cats digging in everything? So physical barriers work, to keep your pets out of your garden, but you also have to consider if you're going to go to some extreme, like a electric fence, that you need to be sure that you're not hurting your pets. It's just never easy out there. So the other three main ways that I control pests in my yard is the shmush, the schmear, and the squish. I have to confess, there is nothing more satisfying than hearing the crunch of a snail under my heel. So I love that. But because you're going to need to go out and you're going to have to do your own patrolling and your own pest management. And you can do that right on the leaf. You can just squish them when you're there. You can take, like I've taken jar lids sometimes, especially on my cole crops, and then just swiped it across the leaf to wipe out the aphids or the white flies. So So go out and pick those pests off. And while you're doing that, grab yourself some soapy water. I use a bucket or a cottage cheese container of soapy water. The concentration doesn't matter, it just needs to be soapy. So, and when you go out into the garden, you can just knock those pests right into the water, and guess what? They can't swim, and so they drown. The other issue is with the soap itself. It helps to coat the insect and make sure that they drown. Yes, I am ruthless. I am mean, but it's them or me as far as the vegetable garden. The other fun, or for me fun, you might think I'm sadistic, but a lot of these pests, especially these harlequin bugs, these harlequin beetles, if you're out in the garden and they're infecting your plants, and when they see you, they just let go and drop to the ground. It's like, I'm going to drop down here and she won't be able to get me. Well, they might as well be dropping into a bucket of soapy water. That's what I'm saying. So I make sure that I have something with me so that I can either let them drop or I knock them into the bucket. And I have to do this every day. So just doing it once in a while doesn't work, because these guys are laying eggs, they're breeding, and so you may have to keep after it. Some other low toxicity controls that you can use, and this is recommended by our IPM specialist, Lizzie Brown, is you can use BT on caterpillars. BT is a substance that the caterpillars eat, and it disrupts their digestive system and it kills them. So it's not an instant thing. So they don't lick the leaf and die. So they have to actually ingest the leaf. So you have to sometimes use multiple applications depending on your infestation level. And the good thing about BT is it's specific to the pest and it doesn't go through the food chain. So if a bird eats your caterpillar or you eat a caterpillar because you didn't wash your vegetables enough, you're fine. Another good thing, we already mentioned a bucket of soapy water, but you can use insecticidal soap on soft-bodied insects like aphids. It also has some use on spider mites and stink bugs. You can also use spinosad, which works on things that have more armor, have shells, and neem oil. I'm going to talk about neem oil. This is where I'm going to lecture. So neem oil has turned into some sort of a panacea, and so we need to break this down a little bit. If you're using an oil and you're coating your plant with an oil, that oil is going to concentrate the sunlight and the heat on the plant. You could actually damage your plant. So if you're going to use neem oil, apply it to the pest, not the plant. And I have seen a lot of advertisements that neem oil is a fungicide. I cannot find any evidence, any research-based evidence showing that neem oil is a fungicide. What it does do is kill the aphids. Aphids secrete honeydew, which then the fungus grows on. So if you kill the aphids, you don't get the fungus, but it's not a fungicide. So if any of you have any research or any trials, send them to me because I can't find them. And I also encourage you to go again to Google this. Go to the there is the National Pesticide information site where you can read about how things, what chemicals or what substances, either organic or not, how they impact pests and how they work. And so if you're going to use any sort of insecticide at all, then please do the research and find out what is it exactly it's doing and how does it actually kill the pest, and make sure that you're, again, read the label and follow directions so that you're not harming your plant. You're going to see copper soap fungicide recommended for downy mildew. The USDA considers some applications of copper okay in an organic food labeling system. You can also buy Serenade, which attacks downy mildew, powdery mildew, and some blights. But whatever you're doing, be careful with product bundling. you'll see some products, and we see this on the fertilizer side all the time, where they bundle things together, like an example of weed and feed. And they really shouldn't be bundled, because you should be treating everything separately. So if there are products bundled together, like this example I have, which is, 3 garden products in one, what is it actually, what are the active ingredients, and what is it actually doing? And should it be bundled according to how you're applying it? So let's talk about weed control. Weeds are a subjective thing. So, and I have this picture of my husband in front of a sunflower. We had a friend come over to our house and look at my sunflowers and go, "Why do you let those weeds grow in your yard?" And I'm like, "What weed?" That's not a weed. That's my finch tree. So weed control, it's about, again, moderation. What is it you're trying to do? And the first thing I want to tell you is put away the jug. Use a hoe or pull them up. In the home vegetable garden, weed chemical control is not recommended. You do not want to do that because of the potential for harm to you or your family. And that's organic or not. So if you've got weeds in your vegetable patch, pull them up. Use a hoe. Make sure to get rid of the weed before it flowers. You do not want it to produce seed, because you don't want to add it to the seed bank that's already in your soil. So use mulches to suppress your weeds. Instead, if you don't want to pull a bunch of weeds, if you don't want to go out there and hand pull, then use a mulch to suppress your weeds. And when you use a mulch, you're going to want to apply that around your established plants. So if you're using seeds, let those seeds germinate and that plant grow a little bit before you put mulch around it, so that you don't smother the seeds that you do want to sprout. The other thing here is that you want to plant in a grid versus row and get that bare ground covered. So weeds are the Marines of the plant world. So it's their job to cover bare ground and establish a beachhead for other plants to follow. So nature abhors a vacuum. So if you've got bare ground, weeds are going to go, "Woohoo, this is finally something to do. I hear the call. I am going to sprout." So they're easily controlled through suppression, either by other plants covering the ground or by mulch. So think about planting in a grid versus a row. And this next slide is an example of like how I plant, because I don't like to weed. I have a full-time job. I don't have time to weed. So what I do is I make sure that I plant in a grid and I plant thick enough so that the bare ground is covered. And I actually let my food crop, shade out the weeds versus using, pulling and for sure, no chemical control. When I say chemical control, I'm including vinegar in that. It's like, don't rely on, again, another, an organic solution for this. Think about what it is you're doing, and use, in the vegetable garden, use mechanical methods. Use your hoe, use your hands, pull them up. So when you're thinking about planting in Texas, we have two gardening seasons. So especially if you're from the north, you're used to having a span of one gardening season. That's not going to happen here. So in the spring, our limiting factor is heat. And so you're going to want to get your plants and seeds in the ground around March 1st. And the reason you do that is you want to make sure those plants have roots and that they're going to be able to survive the onslaught of heat that's coming. So plant seeds on things that mature quickly or that can take the heat, like an okra. Use either grow your own or buy transplants for things that can't necessarily take the heat. And I'm going to include tomatoes in the can't take the heat category. And that's because the pollen on tomatoes will go sterile, on some tomato varieties will go sterile once the nighttime temperatures exceed 76 degrees. And so you want to get a big tomato in the ground as soon as you can in order to set that fruit crop before the heat arrives. The good news about those tomatoes is cherry tomatoes don't seem to be as impacted by high temperatures as regular, like slicer tomatoes. If you've got room and time, stagger your planting so that you've got a food crop coming more evenly through the season. And I do this through varieties rather than staggering. So I'll plant varieties together that have different maturity dates. So I'll have early maturing variety, medium, and late. And so that way I've got a succession of plants. I do this a lot with cucumbers. And I used to do it with squash, but I don't so much anymore because I've got such trouble with squash vine board. In the fall, our limiting factor is frost. And so in the fall, you want to get things in the ground around the 15th of September, or sometimes even a little earlier, depending on what it is you're planting. And in the fall, it's especially critical that if you're going to go plant in the fall, that your ground is moist. So you may have to irrigate for a period of time before you even plant, and that includes transplants. So don't buy a plant or raise a plant and then put it in dry ground. So make sure that you have an adequate moisture in there so that plant can survive. And especially if you're planting seeds, you may need to water every day until that seed germinates and that plant gets established. So again, you need to be outside monitoring what's happening. You can also use shade cloth to do that, but be careful with shade cloth because you don't want to just shade out everything, because that will keep the seed from germinating. So what I have found in my garden is I actually have to pretend like I'm a sunflower and move my shade cloth with the sun. So depending on what it is I'm growing, I may shade something only in the afternoon, or depending on how the sun travels across the property. I have one area where I actually shade against the morning sun because it's so intense of where this one particular bed is, depending on what I have planted there. And then I'll take it off for the afternoon because the afternoon, the western sun doesn't beat down on that particular bed. So know your garden. So go outside. I'm sorry, you can't do this from the couch. Your phone is not going to help you. You need to go outside and look at your plants. And go out at various times during the day so that you know how that sun travels over your property. Brassicas and root crops are okay with a light frost. And again, it's because they have tougher leaves and they don't lose as much moisture. And so the frost doesn't impact them as much. And again, if you have time in the fall, stagger your plantings either by when you get things in the ground or by the maturity date of the plant that you're doing. So let's talk about mulch. I steal leaves. I'm guilty. Home Depot and Lowe's, these leaf bags are the best thing ever because I can go around the neighborhood with my wheelbarrow and gather all the mulch that I need. So that's awesome because I bought my property or bought my house because it doesn't have trees in the backyard. So I have full sun in my backyard because I knew I was going to grow vegetables. So I need the mulch. I only have trees in the front. So my neighbors have gotten used to me going around and taking all their leaf bags. And yes, they make fun of me, but it's worth it because I get free mulch. So the thing about mulch is what you want to do, you can buy mulch, but if you can make it yourself, it's better because you know exactly what it's made of. But the important thing about mulch, especially for us here in Central Texas, is how it helps retain moisture when the Death Star arrives. And I was out this morning and it's like, I'm not ready. So keeping the sun off that bare soil is going to help retain moisture. And it's also going to help regulate the soil temperature so that the soil doesn't heat up so much. If the soil gets too warm, it will inhibit germination and it can inhibit how the roots are able to service the plant. But again, be careful. You want to mulch after the plants are established. So you don't want to cover the seeds up. So you're not going to apply mulch right away. What you can do is you can do sort of like this photo by Patty here in the corner. You can see where we've got mulch in the trench here. You could, after everything has grown, you could then heat that mulch up over your plant so it's ready for you when you need it. If you're going to use mulch, you can make your own. You can use compost as mulch. I do that myself. So because I produce a lot of compost, I screen it. And so anything that doesn't go through the screen is mulch. And so I will actually put that out in the garden if I need the mulch. You can use leaves to do that. If you're going to use leaves, make sure that you run them through the lawnmower or something first so that they don't blow away. Be aware that if you use leaves, the microbe population is going to want to utilize nitrogen in the soil to help to increase their populations, to break down that leaves. And that's why you hear that sometimes leaves deplete nitrogen in the soil. And if you have any questions about that, again, that's a homework assignment. It's an explanation longer than I can give here. But I use leaves a lot, but I use them sparingly. And what I do is I make leaf mold. So part of my composting process is just for leaves to break that stuff down. And so when I need that mulch, I've got something that's already partially digested that I can just put straight out on the garden soil. You can also use hay. When I say hay, that's a loose term. If any of you use hay, hay can be just weeds that went through the hay baler. So know your source. I actually grow my own hay. And I know that sounds nuts, but because I use cover crops in the winter, I use elbon rye and it produces a grass. And so I will cut that grass and then use it as a mulch. You can also use pine straw. Pine straw is really great because it's acidic. It's not always available. So if you're interested in doing pine straw, I use it in my garden. We use it at the demo garden at the extension office, but call ahead to see if they have it before you go, because not everyone carries pine straw. It is usually made from, comes from pine forests. They actually bale the residue that falls from the pine trees. And so you'll have pine needles, you'll have pine cones, and you'll have pieces of branches in there. So it's not super fine. So just be aware. And I have chop and drop. Chop and drop works really good. So what that is, and again, you can do weeds for this as long as they're not seedy, is you grow something and then you just chop it off and then drop it on the ground and let that be mulch. So I do this with my fava beans. So I grow fava beans in the fall as a crop and a cover crop at the same time. So I'll plant them in the fall. I'll get 1 or 2 harvests out of them. And then a couple of weeks ago, they're done. And so what I did is I went along and I chopped them down, ran it through the lawnmower, and voila, instant mulch. So you can use chop and drop. So you could do this with any, you could do this with lawn clippings even, except, be aware that there may be weed seeds in there. So sometimes you don't want to do that. If you're going to buy hay, that's another consideration, that you need to know what the source is. In some hays, there may have been herbicide used to control weeds in that. So if you are going to buy hay or straw and you don't know what the source is, again, pull some out, grow some lettuce in a pot and use the hay to see if there's any pesticide in there. Lettuce is a great, I use it a lot as an indicator whenever I'm trying to test the presence of some sort of contaminant. So let's talk about crop rotation. And this, I've got a homework assignment for you. I've got a site that I want you to go and I want you to read, so please do not write this down. But crop rotation is a great way to control pests, but also to manage the nutrient cycle in your garden. What it is you're rotating one plant family after another. So you're going to follow a plant family after another. And the reason you use the plant families is because different plants have different levels of nutrient uptake and requirements. So, and some of it has to do with, where the roots are. So some deep-rooted plants are going to pull nutrients up from the soil horizon differently than something that's shallow-rooted. Some are heavy nitrogen feeders, others are not. And so, but they all have just different requirements. It's like, human beings are all different. So, so rotating makes sure that you don't wear out your soil, that you're not just taking up one kind of a nutrient. The other big thing that crop rotation does is that it is huge in dealing with soil diseases and pests. We have a huge problem with nematodes here in Central Texas. I have nematodes in my garden. It's one thing that I have to manage for. And I can manage nematodes through crop rotation. So, and I also manage squash vine borers, again, through crop rotation. So remember I mentioned before that that would be an example of why you'd want to till, is because squash vine borers, part of their life cycle is spent in the soil. So if I rotate those crops, then there's a less chance that whatever comes out of that soil is going to attack that specific crop. And again, soil or crop rotation is the best way to control root knot nematodes if you have them. And if you don't have them, don't become too arrogant, because if you exchange plants with someone, if you plant transplants from any nursery that's growing plants in the ground, chances are likely that you're going to bring them home with you. And don't be judgy, don't be arrogant. It's going to happen, but just know how to control it if it does. And if you don't know what root knot nematodes are, they are nematodes that actually go inside of the root and destroy the root's capability of performing as they should. And what you'll find is that you'll get knots or deformities inside the root. I've had a couple of questions about, when people go out, I told you earlier, go out and pull up your bluebonnets and look to see if you've got rhizobia bacteria on it. And the way that you can tell the difference between root knot nematodes and rhizobium nodules is that rhizobia is on the outside of the root and the nematodes are on the inside that cause the deformity. So don't panic if you go pull your bluebonnets up and you see nodules. Those are good nodules. But if you've got root knot nematodes, you'll actually have deformed roots. And I had some really interesting turnips last year because I had a bed that I had neglected to rotate through a crop. And I've got a website down here. I'm going to send this to you in the follow-up email, so you don't need to write this down. But the reason I put this here is these guys, this page on the Lubbock Extension site is the best description I have found anywhere about crop rotation and succession planting and intercropping. It's so good, but they keep moving the page. And so if the link doesn't work, if you just do Lubbock and vegetable rotations, it should come, Mr. Google should deliver it right up. But again, I'm going to send you this link. It's really good information. So everyone on here, please take the time to go visit that page. So when we talk about plant families, what does that mean? Well, that means that most vegetable crops are included in, or I should say, this is a botany thing. All plants are classified within plant families. And again, they behave differently. They have different genetic backgrounds. And so what you eat is different. So that's why you rotate. So I've got these listed here. And again, this is why I want you to go to that Lubbock site, because it's got all this information. But the plant families are in general, and I'm just going to run through these fairly fast. There are the lily or the allium family. So these are like your onions, your chives, your garlics, your leeks, and your shallots are considered one family. Your grasses are a family, and that includes corn. And I've got Elbon rye here because Elbon rye is a rotator crop that I use for nematodes. But you can use corn as a nematode rotator crop. And what I've done in the past is I've tried different varieties of corn, knowing that I'm going to have a plague of earworms. But the primary reason for growing the corn for me at that was for the nematodes. And so I planted my corn super close together, it just as a rotator crop, and then the corn was sacrificed. So the gourd family, that includes the cucumbers, the melons, the squash, and the pumpkins, or AKA squash vine, vor buffet line. You'll find that those squash vine borers, they love squash, but they will also attack anything else in that family. Some of those families have more resistance to the squash vine borer, and so you'll see that some varieties of squash are resistant. And an example is like tutume squash or butternut squash. And the reason they're called resistant to squash vine borers is because the vine roots at each of those nodes. So as the vine creeps along, it'll throw roots down at each of those nodes. And so the squash vine borer is tunneling through the vine. And so in effect, what's happening is that squash is outrunning the borer. You're still getting the squash vine borer, and you're still producing moths that are going to lay eggs on other things and are going to hibernate in your soil, but you may get a crop out of it. So the bush squash, like a zucchini or a crookneck, is not a vining squash, and so it can't outrun the squash vine borer, which is why they are succumb to it so quickly. But the squash vine borer will attack the entire family. I've had them on my cucumbers, I've had them on melons, and then I've had them on other, like, I hate it when they get on pumpkins. That hurts me the most. Legumes, those are your beans, your peas, and your clover. And if you're going to use your legumes as a rotator crop, you need to inoculate your seed. The great thing about legumes is they don't have a lot of pests. And so you'll see aphids sometimes on your fava beans, and you'll get some pests that, like to suck the juice out of your beans. But compared to some other vegetable crops, they don't have as many pests. Then there's the mustard family. And the mustard family for me is the big, my big crop, because I grow it over the winter. And that's your broccoli, your Brussels sprouts, your cabbages, your kales, and your turnips. I grow a lot of turnips, and some people don't know, but radishes are turnips. So any of that is all part of that kale family. The other family is the nightshade family, which is the tomato family. So that you're going to have your eggplant, your peppers, your potatoes, tomatoes, and your tomatillos. I don't grow a lot of this family because I have a food intolerance for nightshades. I didn't find that out until after I moved to Texas. I mean, seriously, what Texan doesn't eat salsa? So it makes me sad. So I grow like 1 or 2 tomato plants for my husband, who can eat them, without issue, but me, I can't. So the other family is parsley. And one note about the nightshade family: these guys need a lot of fertility, and so they're going to be heavy feeders. So if you are going to grow anyone in the nightshade family, you're probably going to have to use some supplemental fertilizer, either organic or not. The parsley family is another big vegetable for me. That's the carrots, the parsley, the dill, and the fennel, and coriander, which is cilantro, and parsnips. Parsnips don't do so well here. They want to have cooler ground, but every now and then, depending on the winter, you can get away with a parsnip crop. But I used to grow these a lot when I lived north because I cook with them. They are the best thing ever for soups, but I just have not had a good success with them here. Other people do though. The other thing about the parsley family that I want to point out, the parsley family is a giant for hosting your predators. So they have, especially, you need to let them bloom. So the flowers on this family are tiny, tiny little flowers that ladybugs and lacewings and wasps, predatory wasps, are all attracted to. So parsley in some form or another should be part of your gardening plan, and you should let it go to seed. And this is good news for people who don't like to eat cilantro. So plant cilantro anyway and let it flower, and use it as a trap plant or as an attraction for your predatory insects. Be careful with interplanting those, because they will cross-pollinate and you'll get some issues, especially if you're saving your seed. The other big area in my garden are the goosefoot family, which is beets, chard, and spinach. So they're all related. Why are they called goosefoot? And again, another rabbit hole you can fall down on the internet. It's because the leaves sort of have a goosefoot shape, but that's what they're called. The daisy family includes your lettuce family. So it's the chicory, the endives, the salsify. If you grow salsify, it's some people consider it a weed. So I grow it for the root. Dandelions, again, is it a weed or is it a greens and root crop? Jerusalem artichokes and globe artichokes are all part of that family. And when you think about it, if you let these guys flower, they have all of those, the same, seed thing where they've got the little parachutes on the seed, so the seed will fly away. So sometimes it's fun to let things go to seed just to see what they look like. The mallow family, of course, that's where our friend okra is. And so we want to make sure to include some of that. And the morning glory family is what sweet potatoes are. So sweet potatoes are not a potato. They are in a completely different family. And so you can use them as a rotator crop. So I want to show you my rotation plan. So I have 11 4x6 planting beds. So that's giving me 264 square feet of garden space. So if we look at that recommendation from earlier, that means that I've got these 11 beds and I'm growing food for just one person. But I do that because I'm a home canner. I freeze food, I dry food, and I also feed 4 neighbors on my street. So I've got a lot that I do. And part of it is that I just love to grow stuff. And so I have found that, sharing with others is a good thing. But I'm also stingy because I use rainwater. And so I'm not going to just grow stuff and use up all my rainwater. So if I have extra food, then I share, but I don't necessarily garden just to garden because I hoard rainwater. So, but here's my rotation plan. And again, this is specific to my garden. I've got some problems that I'm trying to solve here. And one is that I'm on Blackland Prairie. I have deep, heavy clay soils. And so I have to manage that with what I plant. And this is where I struggle every day with the ratio of compost to native soil to get that soil to drain well, but also to retain moisture at the same time. I have nematodes, and I didn't used to have nematodes. I believe I brought them to my yard from buying tomato plants at a plant sale, but they could have been here and I just didn't notice them. But I do have nematodes, and so I manage against that. And the main way I manage against root knot nematodes is I have a grass rotation over the winter, which is Elbon rye. So I will plant Elbon rye as a winter crop in one of these beds as I cycle through the planting cycles. I also have a massive rodent problem. I've got rats, I've got squirrels, I've got rabbits. And so I need to rotate and plan against that. And especially with the rabbits, one of the things I've noticed is there are some plants that they're not going to eat. And one of them is onions. So I have multiplying onions. And so depending on what I'm planting, I will use onions around the perimeter of my planting bed. And that's enough to keep the rabbits moving on down the road. They also, for some reason, don't eat turnips. It's a mystery to me. So they don't like those turnip leaves. They're too maybe it's the fuzz on them or something, I don't know. I love turnip leaves, but the rabbits do not. And so in some cases I'll plant radishes around the perimeter of a bed and then plant something else in the middle to distract that I don't want the rabbits to get after. I also have a huge seed catalog addiction. Going through a seed catalog is one of my favorite things. So unfortunately, a seed catalog addiction means I order a lot of seed. And so I have tried to go cold turkey. I have tried to get counseling. I've tried to share seeds. None of it works. And so I just embraced it. And so what I use it for rotation. And so I test varieties. I will actually sprout leftover seeds like my turnip greens or any herb seeds, I will sprout them and harvest the microgreens as a way to go through my seed bank, basically, because you don't necessarily want to store seed for a long time because the viability decreases. And unless you're, living, part of the, international seed bank, and you've got a room at the perfect freezing temperature that's going to hold that seed in suspension, your seed's going to go bad. And so, so I use crop rotation and I just grow microgreens in flats and harvest microgreens as a way to get through my old seed. So my rotation is, again, I use grass, especially I use corn in the summer and elbow and rye in the fall for nematodes. I use legumes as my main summer crop and my main summer cover crop. So I'll plant vetch or some other, heat peas, cream peas, or some other heat tolerant legume as a cover crop to keep so that I have got bare soil over the summer. I use cucumbers, I rotate in cucumbers in the spring and melons for the summer. This year I didn't plant any squash. This has been one of my years where I was thinking, no more, but I always weaken and come back and try it again. I use okra, the mallow and morning glory family, okra and sweet potatoes as rotation. And because they can take the heat. And then again, the mustard family, that's my main fall crop, and I use turnips for rabbit control. The goosefoot family is my big greens crop over the winter, and I line it with onions for rabbit control. And then my spring, I have some lettuce in the fall, and then some in spring, and then I rotate into the parsley family. So let's talk about, so we talked about rotating crops, but there's also that you want to have succession and interplanting. So succession is planting one crop after another. So it's as one crop nears maturity, you're going to plant another crop alongside of it. So, so if you want to extend your eating season, then you keep something in production all the time. And so so you'll have, like, for instance, what I do is I will, have a over winter crop, and then, but I will make sure that my succession plant is something that can handle the heat. So interplanting is where you plant crops together. You have a faster growing crop planted in between something that grows slower. And if you're going to do interplanting, try to keep it in the same plant family. You don't have to, but if you keep it in the same plant family, you can extend the season. So an example of that would be, growing chives and garlic and bulbing onions together, because chives are going to mature first, your garlic's going to be next, and then your bulbing onions after that, depending on the varieties. So, but also interplanting is planting in a grid pattern instead of rows. And I'm using square foot gardening as an example here, where you're planting different crops together, but in a smaller footprint. There's traditional interplanting methods. The Three Sisters approach, where you grow beans, squash, and corn together, is an example of interplanting. So the main thing is that it really is back to you. How much food do you need? How fast do you need it? And what variety of food do you need? What's your end goal? And so when I look at my garden planning every year, I make a decision of whether or not, what am I going to preserve? So am I out of pickles? Do I need more canned spinach? What is it that I want to preserve? And then I will plant accordingly with that. And I also want to look at, are we sick and tired of eating this? Or do I, do you want to change up and do stuff? And so, as I mentioned earlier, I always try to grow something new, and that's either a new variety or a new type of plant. to me, that's part of the fun of gardening, is the experimentation and finding out what's going to work in your yard. And so one of the things, my things that I want to do is that I use the planet. I look at the latitude of our globe, and I try to grow things or experiment with things that grow at the same latitude as Austin. Now, that's the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. So for instance, when we look at things like okra or watermelon, the Kew Gardens just published or advertised or put out a link for a paper that shows that watermelon, they did the genetic testing, and it actually comes from Northern Africa. So does okra. And so those kind of plants do well here. They're at the same latitude as us. So what that means is that the light and perhaps the temperature is within the same range, and so they will grow well here. So I take, I look at the globe and I follow that latitude line around the globe, and then try different plants in different countries. And so that includes the tip of Africa, that includes, Southeast Asia, but also includes the Horn. So it includes South Africa, parts of Australia. And so for me, it's an adventure, and also in trying to grow some new things and find other vegetables that will be more sustainable in my garden. So it's just part of my citizen scientist thing. So, but it's fun. And so, plus during the summer, you're hiding from the sun. I'm sitting on the couch in the air conditioning. Might as well Google, what's going to grow here. Okay, so the whole point that we're vegetable gardening is to do what? To eat it. So it's really important to think about that. And again, if you're not interested in eating your vegetables, then grow something else, or grow vegetables and donate it to your local food pantry. With the pandemic, a lot of churches and other community organizations have started food pantries. So find a food pantry in your neighborhood and grow food for them. If you don't want to do it yourself. So that also means that if you're growing a vegetable garden, you're going to have to learn how to prepare that food. It's like, no one told me cooking was involved with gardening. So you're going to become an iron chef. So if you do not like to cook, if you hate cooking, if you have no time to cook, then that's going to dictate what you grow. And so you're going to want to go more on the raw side than on the cooked side. So it's going to dictate what you do. I love to cook. And so that's why I grow pretty much everything. So there's some really good handy tools for cooking that I'd like to suggest. And one of them are heavy duty kitchen shears. So what I like about these shears is they don't go dull, they stay sharp longer. And also I use them for harvesting just about everything because it prevents pull damage. Especially this spring, we have had such a wet May that I found that if I wasn't using my scissors for harvesting green beans, I was actually pulling the plant out of the ground because the ground was so wet. So using the scissors to actually harvest works really, really good. It gives you more precision than hand pruners. I have sharp hand pruners, but I still use scissors for harvesting. So I harvest everything with scissors, everything except for corn. So corn I pull off, but everything else I pretty much use scissors for. Scissors are awesome for harvesting greens because you just go along the top and you just mow them down. It's really awesome. The other thing I'd recommend is a soft brush, especially for root crops. If you're storing vegetables dry, brush off the soil versus water, washing them off, because water can invite rot. So just brush the soil off and then store your root vegetables. So I have a little soft brush that I take out there whenever I'm harvesting sweet potatoes or regular potatoes. The other thing that both the brush and the shears do for me is that when I harvest my vegetables, I am going to do my first cleaning of those vegetables over the compost bin. So I will actually take my, sometimes I use my colander to, vegetables, or I have a basket, or, a tub, or, a bucket, whatever. So I will take the crop over to the compost bin and then strip off anything, take the brush, get the leaves off, trim any, bug infested things that I don't want to take into the house. It also gives me another opportunity to inspect the plant for pests, so I can, I can squish the snails, or drop, whatever beetle's still hanging around, on the into a soapy bucket. So the other question we get a lot is, how do you tell if things are ripe? Again, this is a homework assignment. You need to Google when to pick and then put your crop in there. So when to pick cucumbers, when to pick squash, when to pick corn. So the thing about vegetable gardening is that, again, these are annual plants. And so no matter where you're growing them, the information is going to be pretty much the same, because the plants have a very short life cycle. So figure out when to pick that vegetable. And every plant is different. I can't even tell you, that pick things when the leaves start to die, pick things when things start to go yellow. I can't tell you any of that, because it's unique to each plant that you're growing. So make sure that whatever you're planting, that you know when to pick it. The other advice I have for you is to harvest in the morning. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that it's, especially when our heat comes, is the vegetable is usually at its prime in the morning, and it's not started to wilt. And the other thing, which is good, is that in the morning, for me, at least in my garden, is depending on the pests, some of the pests are not as prevalent in the morning because it hasn't warmed up enough for them. The snails are another story. So I get snails in the morning, but that's okay, because I can pick them off and squish them as I harvest. The other important thing, again, this has to do with constraints, is time. So I harvest in the morning because if I wait and do it later in the day, I am too tired to then take the produce that I've worked so hard on growing and have, taken the time to harvest. I'm too tired to cook it and eat it. So for me, it's imperative that I harvest in the morning. So when I do a harvest, then I go through that cycle, is I harvest and then I do the preparation up to the point where I'm going to prepare it for the meal. And I get that done in the morning while I still have the energy. Because if it's 3 PM and I've been slogging it out in the yard all day, all I want to do is sit on the couch. And all I want to do is either beg the husband to cook dinner, or we're going to eat out. And that's just wrong. I spent all that time growing this amazing food, and I'm too lazy to eat it because I'm tired. So that's what I do for me, is I make sure that I do all my harvesting in the morning, and I do the food prep, which includes, like, if I have to chop, if I have to peel, if I have to marinate, whatever, I'm going to do that in the morning before then I go back out in the yard to do anything else. The other thing about harvesting is you've got to check every day. Things grow so fast. And if you're growing okra, you need to check more than one time a day. I love okra, but if you turn your back on it, you will have cruise missiles that you cannot eat. And so I actually harvest okra at least twice a day. And sometimes I've had to harvest 3 times in a day. I mean, that's just crazy. But I like my okra small. I do not want okra like this. And we just throw our okra on the grill and eat it right away. So you also need to watch the weather. So whatever app you're using or information that you're using for the weather, you need to watch for the weather and plan for it. So you need to prepare for frost. You need to know what's coming, and that's going to dictate your harvesting as well. So if you know that a cold front is coming through, you may want to pick things ahead of time. If you know that we're going to get a heat wave coming through, then that is going to dictate your irrigation schedule and also your harvesting schedule. So you need to be a weather watcher. And you need to become an expert on the weather in your garden. And it's really frustrating here in Central Texas because we don't even share the same weather. So because most of our weather comes through as thunderstorms, they're isolated incidents. And so I've had instances where the neighbors at the top of my street got rain and I got nothing. It made me mad. So you've got to become an expert of weather in your garden. There's no substitute for that. You're also going to need to watch for critters. And so there's no better thief than a squirrel and no more wily animal than a rat. And so you watch for critters and other pests, and you're going to need to do that every day. And when you need to inspect your plants, you don't need to, this is not drive-by stuff. You need to go in, you need to touch your plant, you need to turn that leaf over, you need to see what's eating it or not. And that also allows you to look at the soil underneath and check to see if your irrigation schedule is good. The other thing I want to tell you is to eat raw whenever possible. Your vegetables are at their peak when they are before you cook them. And so if you can eat raw, in our house it's kind of a joke because a lot of our vegetables never make it to the house. So I have yet to cook an asparagus spear this year because I just eat it out in the garden. So green beans, peas, yeah, they never make it in the house. The other thing is that whatever you're growing, try to eat the whole plant. So things like beets and turnips, carrots, sweet potatoes, beans, peas, you can eat it from tip to root. And so figure out how to eat the whole plant, and that reduces your food waste, but that also gives you different nutrition from each area of that plant. And also can dictate your planting schedule or how you plant. And so for instance, on beets and turnips, I plant them really, really close together from seed. And then I thin them as they age, and then I thin out the plant and eat them raw as salad. Or I'll cook them depending on what size they are. So eat the whole plant. Sweet potatoes are my main green vegetable in the summer because I can't grow squash. So I eat sweet potato leaves all summer, and then I have sweet potatoes to dig in the fall. Now that does give me a smaller tuber, but because I'm eating on that thing the whole time, it's a win for me. If you've got bug problems, especially like aphids, soak your produce in salt water first, and that will help get the aphids off. And it also helps get the snails to detach. So if it's super buggy, just soak it in water first, and that really helps. And I do that just right in the sink, or I'll have I'll have a bucket of soapy water and a bucket of salty water out by the compost bin that I just jam stuff in. So far this year, I haven't had many aphid problems, so I haven't had to have my salt water bath before I eat them. So we've made it. We've made it from plant to plate. So I want to call out one really great resource for you guys, and that is on our website. If you will Google our favorite gardening resources for Austin, you'll get our entire list of resources from both the Travis County Master Gardeners and Texas A&M, and then other extension programs of really good information on what to do, and it will allow you to deep dive into any of those topics. And so I really encourage you to do that. So let's take some questions.
Yeah, it's great information, Sheryl. I appreciate your thorough and well-explained presentation. And I love that muffin tin hack. That's really clever. I love hacks of any kind, gardening and non-gardening. So my ears perk up when I hear about a hack in the garden. So thank you for sharing that. We do have some questions. So let's jump in. Our panelists have been answering them as well, but we're going to get back to a couple that I think are kind of on topic. And let's see. So back to soil. If you garden in containers or raised beds, what's your suggestion for adding nutrients back to the soil at the end of the season? And when or how often should the soil be totally refreshed or replaced in a raised bed or a container?
So the answer, of course, is it depends. And so if you're gardening in a container, like a garden pot, or even if in a contained raised bed, it depends on what it is you're adding through that growing season. So you'll see a lot of advice about replacing the soil every year. So do you need to do that? Well, if you're not adding any more nutrient, if you're not adding compost, or you're not fertilizing, or you're not replenishing organic matter, then you're probably going to have to add some in. In my ornamental containers, I try to use native soil and potting soil and my own homemade compost. So I don't swap out my soil. I found that I don't need to, but I do add new ground or native soil and compost every year. If you're not doing that, then you may be in a cycle of where you need to replace your soil. But think it through. So why are you doing that? Do you have to do that? How can you avoid doing that? Because again, if you've got a contained microclimate that there's no outside influence, then it's totally dependent on you adding stuff in. But if you can make it part of any sort of natural cycle, that takes the pressure off of that. So the answer is that depends.
As with everything. And I would caution people growing in containers, especially using native soil and compost. You are very well versed in all of that, and you understand the science behind it all. But when you use native soil in a container, it can get very heavy. It can also have contaminants in it, potentially, not things that would hurt you, but things that make the soil not the best for plants to grow in. And then compost can often be too rich, so you have to be careful you don't add too much of it in a container. It's different for a raised bed. But most growing nurseries or growing advice is in containers to use a soilless mix. So it makes it lighter weight. And then that does get broken down though. So the volume will decrease. And then what you can do is either bump it up to a larger container or just add some soil to the top to increase the volume. There's different ways to get around that. So
exactly. And you're going to add weed seeds if you use native soil. So that's another consideration. And you will add also bad fungal issues, from your native soil too. So again, know your spot, do the research, experiment with it, and find what works best for you.
All right, next question, still on soil. I get my soil for my raised beds from a local landscape company, and they call it a garden mix. Does that qualify as native soil?
Maybe. So this is why it's so important that when you buy your soil, that you actually see the soil before you buy it, if at all possible. If you're going to a soil yard, sometimes you can buy soil by the bag. If you're going to do that, buy one bag, take it home, look at it, see how it interacts with what it is you're trying to do before you make a big purchase. But the main thing is like with everything else, read the label. So you need to ask them, what is that soil contained of? Especially when I go to the big box stores, I see bags that are called garden soil. There's no soil in those. It's all organic.
All organic matter.
It's a soilless mixture. Yeah. So you can use that soil in your garden, but it's not garden soil. So depending on your interpretation, it could be wrong. Now, the other thing is, the question about native soil. So just because I buy soil from a reputable soil yard here in Austin doesn't mean it's native soil to Austin. So a lot of these soils come from other processes. They come from development. They come from dredging lakes or rivers. They come from other areas where that soil is actually mined and brought somewhere, and it could be nowhere near Austin. So if you're buying it from a soil yard and it's real soil, is it native? Who knows? You have to ask that question. So that's why you need to not just, buy something blindly, but ask a couple of questions. And even if you do ask the questions, you may not get the answers. And so you just make your best judgment, but at least go through the process of trying to understand what's there. And my advice is always don't make a big purchase until you've tested out that soil in your situation to make sure that it's going to work for you.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you brought up the fact that now when you go to buy a product at any nursery center, a bag of it will say garden soil and there's zero soil in it. It is all organic matter. It's meant to be used in the garden, but it is not soil. So it really does take trial and error and experimentation and then time put into the garden to learn these things. So I really appreciate you pointing that out. All right, let's get on to a pest. How to get rid of squash bugs.
So You mean squash bugs or squash vine borer? So I'm gonna do both.
Yes.
So
Good.
yeah.
Do them both. Let's do them
So
both.
squash bugs are a bug that crawls around on the squash itself, and it will attack the fruit and it will attack the plant itself. And those are candidates for my bucket of soapy water. So those guys get slapped in the water, or you could just squish them, on the plant. So that's part of my, my frustration therapy when I'm out in the garden. So those soapy water works really good. Squash vine borers, there's a lot of advice on how to combat squash vine borers. None of it has worked for me. So I'm going to share with you what I've done. I have a heavy infestation of squash vine borers. And it makes me crazy because the first couple of years that I gardened, I didn't have any. And so I was making fun of people who had them. And so karma is not good. So there's some advice over, actually cutting open the vine and, killing the borer inside the vine. You can do that, but sometimes you'll actually kill the plant when you do that. So doing surgery on your squash vine doesn't always work. BT applications will work, but again, remember that the borer is inside the vine. So if you're going to apply BT, really the only time it works is when that initial period when those eggs hatch and that borer eats the outside of the plant and goes into the vine. Once it's in the vine, the BT can't necessarily get to it. So that's an issue. Last time I was weak and I missed my pumpkins. And so I'm like, I'm going to plant them again. And I used pheromone traps. So they're containers, they're yellow because, the moth is attracted to yellow, and it's a pheromone trap. And so I put them in the garden, around the garden. And oh my gosh, I caught 50 moths in a period of 10 days. I still got an infestation. So while they were attracted to that, they still laid eggs on my squash. So I've tried hand pollinating using row covers and hand pollinating, and that worked fairly good, but I have to hand pollinate all that stuff. And to hand pollinate, I have to lift the row cover. And I tried to do it at noon when the moths were not active, but somebody still snuck in there and laid an egg. So I've just not had any luck. I've planted resistant varieties and outrun it, and that works really great, but you're still producing moths. And so even though it's outrunning it and you may get a crop, you're still your infestation doesn't go away. So I'm telling you that the best pest control, especially if you're an organic gardener, is to pull up the plant or change to something else. If you've got a heavy infestation, pull the plant up. Your crop is in stress. There's nothing that you can do. These insects, these issues, this disease is in the environment. So if you've got a heavy infestation, switch to something else. That's the best organic method you can do.
Very good advice. Okay, next question. What is your opinion of Ruth Stout's approach to gardening? Lots of hay. I'm not sure who Ruth Stout is, but apparently she uses lots of hay.
I'm not sure what root stout is either. Like I mentioned, I grow my own hay in a small scale. I wouldn't feed a horse or a goat even, but I grow my own grass and harvest it and use the chop and drop method to either lay that grass on the ground or I'll run it through the lawnmower. I don't use grass clippings because there's too many weed seeds in it, but I will run my hay that I grow myself through because I know that it's weed free. So, but I'm not sure what the other thing is. Maybe if you want to send us an email and explain more, we could try to get back to you on that.
And do you have any other tips for stand-up raised gardens? Maybe that's raised beds. I'm not sure what that is either.
So for raised beds, I use recycled lumber for that. And so because I'm a scrounge, I go around and to the neighborhood and people who are replacing their wood fences, I take their boards and that's what I make my raised beds out of. But you can build your own raised beds if you're handy at all. You can also, you can buy raised bed kits. There's several gardening companies that you can buy wooden kits. And there's also, like through Gardener Supply, I believe you can buy metal raised beds. Those are all fine. Basically what a raised bed is anything that is basically a container that you're setting on the ground. So as far as growing up, I use fence wire, and I use bamboo poles. I use, again, because I scrounge fence boards, I rip those boards into 2x2s and I use those for poles. So anything that will grow up. And then I have, normal tomato cages that I use to grow up. So I'll use tomato cages to grow beans on, for example, to grow up. So that way I can grow beans up and then grow something else at the feet of the beans at the same time.
And what do you use as far as the ratio of volume in a raised bed? So soil to compost when you're first building it.
So it depends on what your soil is. And so for me, I had such heavy clay soil. At the very beginning, I used a 50-50 mix, and it was wrong. It's too much compost. So what I have found when I, brought new beds into production, I scaled that way back, and and then it was not enough. And so I have found that to begin with, for the initial mix for my garden in my heavy clay soil, I was using by volume 20 to 30% of native soil. And then as I go through the growth season, then I am learning that I need to monitor how much compost I add, because in some cases, my bed had too much compost in it and it wasn't retaining water. And so I had to add native soil back in. So that's why I decided this year, I think I've got it solved, but I had some issues on this last gardening season. And so I sent it off to A&M to get the test. And that's when I discovered I've got, by volume for my soil, 8% organic matter. So, so that tells me I'm a little on the rich side. And so I have modified my gardening practices accordingly, where I'm not just automatically adding in compost. So I'm going to try to manage it now with, compost as a top dressing, but manage the crops that I plant instead, so that I don't get that ratio off. If you're gardening on limestone, it's completely different because you don't have a lot of soil depth. And so it's going to be really easy to get that ratio off. You're going to add too much compost. Really easy. The compost is awesome for, helping, break down the limestone, but it just depends on your own garden.
And I would say that when people build raised beds, who has soil in their yard that they could put into that? Nobody. The reason you're building a raised bed is because you don't have soil. So you've got to purchase soil to put in. And that's going to be a fair amount of soil. So you're probably going to buy that in bulk. And just like with bagged soil that you have that you buy in bulk still is very heavy on their organic matter. And so we field questions every year from people who have just built a brand new raised bed. You've answered these questions too, Sheryl. And they're like, I just built this and all my plants are dying. They will not grow. And it's because that bed hasn't been seasoned yet. And so no matter your volume of what you use, when you first build a raised bed, you need to mix that soil thoroughly and wet it. Mix it and wet it, mix it and wet it, because until you get the entire thing wet, it cannot retain water. So just like if you have a container that's all the way dried out and you try to water from the top and the water goes through immediately and the soil is all still dry, the same thing happens in a raised bed. And so you need to, in a container, you would put that container into a bucket of water and let it soak from the bottom. You can't do that in your ground. You've got to get the soil wet. And it's just that's not logical for people to think that, but you have to season new soil when you get it, because it really doesn't have enough soil in it, enough mineral soil, sand, silt, clay, not enough there. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today. We'll follow up individually with any unanswered questions. Thank you, Sheryl. I really appreciate your enthusiasm for growing food crops and your willingness to share your wealth of knowledge and experience with us. And thank you to our attendees for participating. Very soon, you'll receive an extensive email from us, including a link to a short survey, and we'd really appreciate it if you filled that out. Your feedback will help to ensure that Extension can continue to offer these types of valuable programs in the future. That email will also include a link to access the recording of today's session, a list of resources for further study, and links to any websites or source material listed today by Sheryl, along with information on how to contact our gardening helpline to ask any question that you have in the future, and how to subscribe to notifications for future seminars in our Drought to Deluge series, as well as other AgriLife Extension programs on horticulture and gardening. Until next time, thank you for joining us and happy gardening.